Hey Andres.
Hello, hello.
Hey, how are you?
Good, good. How are you? How are you?
Very well, thank you. Good to see you.
Oh,
Thanks
likewise.
for.
Let me change my microphone.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
All right. How do I sound? Does it sound better?
You sound good. How do I sound? Can you hear me and see me okay?
Yes, yes, I can.
Oh, brilliant. Cool. I'll just say a little introduction for the for our audience later. My name's Adam James Davis. I'm going to be doing a series of interviews on behalf of Herbivorize Predators research team. And yeah, we have Andres Gomez Emilsson here. So thank you very much, Andres. I've started recording. I hope you don't mind.
No, perfect.
Cool. Yeah, obviously you're a recognizable name within qualia studies and contemporary psychedelia and consciousness philosophy, and you run the Qualia Research Institute and Qualia Computing Network, and you have a really awesome blog called Qualia Computing. Is there anything else, anything you wanted to say to introduce yourself?
Sure. I mean, like I was one of the co-founders of the Stanford Transhumanist Association back in the day,
Mm,
which is actually how I met David Pierce, like in 2011, I believe.
brilliant.
I mean, I had read him before, like probably from 2007.
Mm,
But it was thanks to starting a student organization dedicated to those topics that I actually was able to invite him and bringing him over. So I definitely recommend that if you're in college, you should think of your time there as a possible force multiplier. In that you
mm,
can, yeah, basically create some pretty cool groups to discuss like basically things of interest like transhumanism, or in this case wild animal
mm.
suffering, or effective altruism, or yeah,
Y-
I don't know, preventing civilizational collapse. So whatever is the thing that interests you the most, I
Yeah.
highly recommend basically a student organization,
Oh,
and inviting philosophers and speakers like David Pierce. And I think it's about then that I actually learned about wild animal suffering,
mm.
and started reading like Brian Tomasic or so. But yeah, so I guess it's been a while. I've been these ideas have been bouncing off in my head for a while now. So.
Yeah. David Pierce was also my one of my first inspirations for getting into futurism and transhumanism. It was David Pierce and Ray Kurzweil. Um, so that they were the primary my primary inspirations as well. And uh, I feel most affiliated with suffering abolitionism, and of course, transhumanism is made up of all these different um, have uh, it covers a lot of different topics, life extension and consciousness experiments and expansion and wild animal suffering and human suffering. So I also feel most aligned with people like yourself and David Pierce and that kind of that school of thought. Um, and what I like about you, Andres, is that you work in the same or similar tradition as David Pierce, like a successor. Would you say?
Maybe, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I would
Mm,
say definitely the Qualia Research Institute also ended up like bringing up like things of its own. So, for
mm,
example, like I don't believe the symmetry theory of valence, or I don't know, like that kind of explanation. I don't think that was kind of a in any way, part of
mm,
David Pierce's philosophy or pre-existing in transhumanism. If anything, like that would be kind of an influence from Mike Johnson and Romeo Stevens, but largely something that we constructed
yeah.
as a team. Um, and obviously, those things do have bearings on, like, okay, like what would utopia look like? In that,
Mm,
okay, like if pleasure and positive valence is actually an ingredient of any kind of decent utopia, probably some kind of like deep understanding of valence is going to be necessary. And in that sense, we are maybe a slightly different school of thought, because I would imagine, yeah, kind of like the David Pearce um, pure line, you could say, would focus primarily on, okay, like what are the biochemical signatures of pure bliss? Like what are the, you know, biomolecular substrate of valence, as opposed to, yeah, how we are thinking about it, which is like, okay, what pattern, you know, what specific patterns of electromagnetic activity correspond to positive versus negative valence. We're not necessarily as interested in, you know, the biochemical layer of abstraction. We're like more
Yeah.
interested in like, okay, like what is the structural features of consciousness that matter here, which is actually also different than, I guess, like somebody like Ray Kurzweil, who would be thinking about it in terms of the algorithmic level of abstraction. It's like, okay, like is there reinforcement learning, or I don't know, are the algorithms of emotion being instantiated, which to us is actually a little bit too abstract. You actually need to ground it in implementation. Um, but yeah, in that sense, I would say like we're kind of a hybrid. I would say like a hybrid. Um, Probably the best way to describe us would be in terms of the lineages that feed into us. And David Pearce is one of the lineages, but then we also have like Buddhism, but then also,
Yes.
you know, Carl Friston and Robin Carhart Harris and Salanata Soy and Stephen Lehar. So yeah, there's a bag of interesting people that feed into the way we perceive the world at Qualia Research.
Yeah. So would you say it goes biochemical substrate and then electromagnetic and then algorithms? Is there like a kind of a matryoshka doll, or more levels deeper?
Yeah, to some extent, yeah. So I mean, the most basic breakdown would be what we call like the Marr's levels of analysis, and like that's also David Marr is also one of the lineages at QRI. So basically, those are like three layers that are, first of all, like behavior. He also calls it the computational layer, but basically, like what is the, you know, physical system doing? How does it is like what is the mapping of inputs to outputs that this physical system generates? And for some people, that is actually what matters. Like, for example, for behaviorists, I don't know, like Pavlov, they might actually say like, yeah, you know, what matters is the input-output mapping. And like, so there's like this joke of like two behaviorists are having sex, and like,
Sorry, I
and
think
they're
I've got to the punchline yet. I'm already laughing. Sorry,
right.
continue.
And yeah, so that when they want to figure out like if they're having fun, you know, they ask their partner, is like, oh, how am I doing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like this notion of like the the person who will be the best equipped to tell how you're doing is actually somebody who can see all of your behavior, as opposed to even yourself. Like if you're a hardcore behaviorist, you may think that way. Um, then there's also like the second kind of layer would be the algorithmic layer, which is essentially what is going on with bits of information. Like how are the bits of information being translated from the input to the output? You actually track what is the algorithmic procedure that those bits undergo. Um, and then finally, you have the implementation layer, which is like, okay, at the physical level, how is this information processing being implemented? And and basically at QRI, we believe that consciousness actually resides at the implementation level.
Okay.
And in that sense, we're actually the same as David Pearce. David Pearce also believes, you know, it happens at the implementation level. The difference, though, is that he believes it has to do with, okay, like the particular shapes of proteins inside your neurons. Like that
Right.
is like the thing that determines, okay, like your qualia. Whereas we also believe that actually the thing that matters is implementation, but we focus much more on essentially what is the configuration of the fields of physics throughout your brain, which is kind of like a very different way of looking at it. It's like we of course like suspect that yes, the shapes of proteins matter, but probably the thing that determines the most your valence is the holistic organization of the fields of physics that are implementing your experiences. So it's kind of like a fairly different lens as opposed to, yeah, okay, like what is the biochemical signature?
Mm.
But we are still in some sense much closer to each other than, let's say, with Ray Kurzweil's theories of consciousness, which would be algorithmic in nature. So in that sense, yeah, probably David Pearce is much more similar in his theory of consciousness to us than to Ray Kurzweil.
I see. So the shapes of proteins, is that similar to how different frequencies sound translate into different pitch or different colors? Is it that kind of?
It could be. So there is this general problem. You might call it the input qualia mapping problem. So it's
Oh,
essentially like how do particular sensor inputs translate into qualia varieties and values. So a qualia variety is like, for example, all phenomenal color, all possible sensations of color. A value is a specific, shade of a particular color. Like
mm,
let's say a particular shade of blue would be a qualia value. Um, and Essentially we believe that like the translation between like physical input and qualia varieties and values is quite like programmable, that like
mm,
it is not necessarily the case that a visual input will give rise to visual qualia, and definitely not like phenomenal color.
okay.
Why? Because you actually have a lot of cases where, for example, somebody may have synesthesia, that they experience actual phenomenal colors um, in a very very rich way just by listening to music. They
Mm,
could have like their eyes closed. They could even be blind. Like they could actually have like missing eyes, but still be able to experience the phenomenal qualities of color.
oh, I see.
So
Okay.
so in a sense, like the mapping between sensor input and the quality that you experience is a mapping that is evolutionary adaptive. Like
Mm.
there's a reason why we experience colors through our eyes as opposed to our ears most of the time,
Ah, okay.
but it's not a necessary connection. It's just kind
Mm,
of like for some reason it is computationally efficient to have the mapping that we have. So one quip that I sometimes say is that we are all actually synesthetic. It's just that we have an evolutionarily adaptive form of synesthesia, that actually there's no um, objective ground truth to like how sensory inputs should be mapped to particular quality values and varieties. I mean, in that sense, like both David Pearson and everybody at QRI will agree that like you could experience, for example, um, phenomenal color. You could experience this particular pink or this yellow while you're dreaming without like
oh, yeah.
necessarily having to have like any visual stimulation. Now, David Pearce would suggest that like the actual quality of color will be determined by the particular protein shapes inside the neurons that are responsible for color
Oh,
qualia.
mm,
Whereas I find that to be like maybe jumping to conclusions at this point. We don't necessarily know that. We do know that there are like specific regions of the brain with specific gene expression that are necessary for the phenomenal quality of color. Like that without them, you will be colorblind. Like if you have a particular damage in a particular part of your visual cortex, you might become just, physiologically colorblind.
mm,
But exactly what that is doing to generate the phenomenal colors is something that I'm not quite sure. And it could actually be a holistic effect. It could be
mm.
that it's modifying the topology or the shape of the entirety of the field in order to generate those particular phenomenal qualities. So I'm not entirely sure if you can zoom in into a cell and essentially say like, okay, it's actually these proteins that are responsible for these, yeah, phenomenal quality.
I think hopefully in our lifetimes we will find out and come to
Mhm.
a solution. and get more information about that. Yeah, you
Yep.
reminded me of studies of blind people taking LSD and other psychedelics, and the kind of visual experiences they might have, even though they are blind.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the two behaviorists having sex, it reminded me of the idea that too much of a meta awareness of how much pleasure or how much pleasure you're feeling or how much happiness you're feeling or will diminish after as soon as you have a bit more of a meta awareness of how good you feel.
Yeah. I mean,
Sorry.
I can comment briefly on that. I mean, that is like true in general, and it's called a little bit like the paradox of pleasure. That like if you pursue pleasure directly, you will experience less of it,
Yeah.
as opposed to like, yeah, I don't know, pursuing like just having like fun, or let's say like
in the flow
pursuing
state.
the highest score at a
Yeah.
game,
Yeah.
like that might indirectly actually maximize your fun. But I would say though that um, that actually is kind of like very specific to the thing that you're doing, because there are situations where actually mindfully trying to maximize your pleasure will maximize your pleasure. And
okay.
there is one very simple example, which is jhana practice.
Oh yes.
Basically, yeah, states of very high concentration, specifically the Lee Brasington method, which is all about like going into a very relaxed state of mind, and then scanning your body for pleasurable sensations. And then whenever you experience
Wow.
a pleasurable sensation, you just let it bubble up and kind of like try to expand it and nourish it and cultivate it. And if you do this for many hours, after, I don't know, like a year or two, um, it will actually allow you to surface this very, very strong bodily pleasure that you can amplify and then enter into these altered states called the jhanas. So there's like one example where actually pursuing pleasure directly will significantly multiply pleasure itself. So yeah, basically the pleasure principle, the pleasure paradox has its limits.
Yeah. So jhana could be a way out of the hedonic treadmill.
Yep.
You mentioned the symmetry theory of valence. Is that referring to the pleasure pain axis that you see David use a lot? Okay.
Yeah. So several related terms. Pleasure pain axis is one. Valence is another. Hedonic tone. They all are essentially the same thing, but have like subtly different connotations. And David Pierce actually, he would describe himself as a hedonic tone kind of person, in that like he prefers that term as opposed to valence, because
Okay.
valence, it sounds like very clinical, very like academic, but that's
Right.
actually why I prefer it, because like I don't like to say pleasure as much, because it sounds very shallow. It sounds like one
Yeah.
dimensional. Um, it
Hollow.
sounds
Yeah.
like you're like you have a very vacuous kind of existence. It's like, oh, like you're just a pleasure
Pleasure
vampire or
seeker.
some
Yeah. Yeah.
pleasure seeker. Whereas like valence like emphasizes that like actually this is a very general phenomenon, and like when you're listening to opera and having a very meaningful experience, or you just had a your child and you're having this powerfully meaningful moment, that would be a high valence experience. Maybe it is not traditionally a pleasurable experience, like it's not like you're experiencing body pleasure in an obvious way. Well, actually, I would probably claim that if you're having like a tremendously wonderful time because your first child was just born and you're seeing it for the first time, most likely actually that is manifesting in a bodily way. But that's kind of as an aside. Essentially, the nice thing about the word valence is that it doesn't import into your is not something that has like obvious cultural imports that are limiting. In a sense, like valence really refers to um, a property that any experience shares. So like for example, like a particular sound has a valence, and a particular taste has a valence. Um, Even like very weird sounds, like the
Yes.
sound of a train. It's not a, we didn't evolve to have a emotional response to it, but it will still have a valence. And you can have like abstract sounds that have like
Ah,
very strong negative or very strong positive valence. And um, in some senses, like a very, very general property. And the other thing that kind of like becomes emphasized with these is that really valence is a kind of like a triangle, in that you can have like very strong pure positive valence, you can have strong pure negative valence, but you can
mm,
also have a lot of like mixed valence experiences. And on top of that, you can have different valence on different parts of your spectrum. So essentially you can have high frequency positive valence, like very high frequency vibrations that are like in a very pleasant configuration,
yes.
while at the same time experiencing low frequency negative valence, let's say like low frequency dissonance. So you can actually have like all kinds of crazy experiences where you have like positive valence in some regions of the spectrum, neutral valence in some other region,
Mm,
and negative valence in some other regions, and that will give it rise to a very complex, very very detailed experience with a mixed valence. But you can still describe in what way it has positive or negative valence, and in that sense, yeah, think of it as kind of like much closer to the actual phenomenon. Like pleasure and pain are in some sense like a more narrow phenomena. I mean, in the end, you can effectively talk about like emotional pain. You can talk about, let's say, like musical pain, but it sounds like it's kind of like stretching the word a little bit and taking it outside of the context that we're more familiar with.
mm.
Whereas valence more naturally can be applied to like anything. Any sensation has valence characteristics.
You reminded me of a lot of the electronic music I like to listen to when you're talking about sounds there, and I do enjoy electronic music for that reason. And yeah, I do find the idea of mixed valence experiences very compelling. Like uh, I can imagine crazy scenario where someone's experiencing heaven and hell simultaneously.
Yep.
My imagination takes me to all these places when we talk about this kind of stuff.
Yeah. No,
Um,
and that's actually super important,
mm,
because um neither, like in my experience, I actually should really write a blog post at the very least about this, but essentially, like utilitarianism doesn't know what to do about mixed experiences,
mm,
about mixed
right.
valence experiences. In fact, I don't really see them discussed very much, even though they're like such a huge part of life. So
Mm,
um, when you talk about like a negative utilitarian or a classical utilitarian, usually people are talking like fairly naively in terms of like, okay, each moment of experience has an associated, pleasure or pain value.
yes.
But how do you distinguish the following three scenarios? Like in one scenario, somebody's not experiencing anything. Let's say it's
Mm,
kind of equivalent to being dead. In another one, they're
mm,
experiencing a lot of sensations, but they're all perfectly neutral. Let's say like they're listening to very loud white noise,
yeah.
but it's neither
No, it's fine.
attractive nor repulsive. They're
Right.
they're
Yeah.
kind of like in a weird, completely neutral, but like very loud
Mm,
state. Or in the third scenario, they're experiencing both excruciating pain and excruciating meaning, or like powerful meaning at the same time. And and the way in which that feels from the inside is kind of like, yes, intensely aversive, but
yeah.
also profoundly meaningful or profoundly significant. And in
Ah,
some sense,
yes.
they kind of balance each other out, where like you're not sure whether you're actually like existing or not at that point,
Yeah.
because they kind of like are compensating each other.
Yeah.
So those three scenarios are in some sense neutral, right? Like they're like neutral valence, but actually they're completely different experiences, right?
Yeah.
And I haven't really seen like a theory of utilitarianism that is good at accounting for those scenarios. It's like, how do you even make sense of them?
Yeah, I think that'll be something that you could write about, and I think that would be a very novel idea for people. Yeah, it seems kind of sometimes a bit paradoxical and a bit horseshoe as well. Like mixed valence could be novel enough to actually be pleasurable. And yeah, one aspect I find the most puzzling is the idea of neutrality, or a neutral point between pain and pleasure. I'm not convinced there can be a true point of neutrality on a spectrum between uh, two polar opposites or extremes. It kind of puzzles me in the same way as nothing does. Like, why is there something from nothing? Even nothing is a something. It just seems quite seems a bit like it couldn't exist, a bit like nothing. But I'm sure people would disagree that you can have like a neutral state.
Mhm.
But
I feel like you can, but
yeah,
they're definitely. I mean, there are states where like it's ambiguous
mm,
whether it makes sense to exist in that state
mm,
or not. Like, yeah, you could sort of describe them as like you can take them or leave them. And like
yeah,
it's like, yeah, like it's kind of cool, but but it has like enough harshness that I might just not experience it. And um, yeah, I don't know, like when you're getting sufficiently tired at a concert, and it's kind of like there's a
yeah,
threshold where like yes, I do want to continue listening and dancing, but I'm just slightly tired enough that like the balance doesn't quite work out anymore. Like, okay, maybe you're just hit a perfectly neutral experience at that point.
right, yeah. Yes, it's a quite strange thing to consider, and I think we touched upon something quite important, that the pleasure-pain axis could be considered too simplistic or even inaccurate, because of course the pleasure-pain axis is a one-dimensional line, and I think maybe something more three-dimensional or complicated would be would better represent uh, um, the way, you know, way we talk about this stuff. Like we could have a more complicated system where there's meaning, like meaningfulness, meaninglessness, pleasure, pain, noble pains, evil pleasures, suffering, not suffering, on all different, all factor in. Um,
Yeah.
because of course with like um, evil pleasures, that could be, one of them could be Schadenfreude, or noble pain could be uh, but enduring hardship to rescue someone. Um, and yeah, I think the title, something like the hedonistic imperative, the name could give people maybe the wrong impression. And
Mm.
something like sex, drugs, and rock and roll is called folk hedonism, I believe, rather than more sophisticated states we like to talk about. Um,
Yep. Yeah, that is interesting. Like the hedonistic imperative, it's I mean it's light years away from like yeah, sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Absolutely, yeah. By orders
But
of magnitude, yeah.
yeah, no, on the surface maybe it sounds a little bit like it. And I do know like quite a lot of people who have like a negative valence reaction to the term hedonism.
Mm,
So it's definitely important to find some kind of substitute for them at the very least.
yeah, yeah. And you described very well the kind of hybrid nature of the schools of thought we were involved in. So, uh, like a mixture of suffering abolitionism and psychedelic exploration and consciousness research. But with you, I think you lean somewhat more into the realm of psychedelia, whereas David is quite cautious about that for obvious reasons. And
Yep.
he's quite strongly connected and influential within wild animal suffering and the suffering of all life in a kind of Tomasic-esque kind of fashion. Whereas you're not, would you say you're not a name so instantly and readily associated with wild animal suffering, or is it something you thought about, you think about often?
I think a lot about it, and I'm
Mm,
very sympathetic towards it. But it's very true that I have not written very much about it. I would say
mm,
that the theoretical and memetic foundations of QRI are very applicable to studying wild animal suffering. And they're like really relevant, and I'm very happy to kind of walk you through the ways in which we can provide like unique contributions, I think. Um,
Absolutely.
but it is very much the case that like you're not going to find, you know, wild animal suffering articles on QRI yet.
Sure.
I do expect to actually write a couple um, specifically on yeah, some topics I'm happy to cover. But essentially, it's not a place where I think like we have like super strong comparative advantage. I think where, yeah, I mean, like the places where we can actually make the biggest contributions, I would name. I mean, essentially, I mean, one of them is psychedelic theory. I mean, I very much think we can actually provide true, novel, meaningful, and non-trivial contributions to the field of psychedelic research, and that's what we're doing. I mean, like we're doing quite a lot of that. I'll be giving a presentation at the Amsterdam Psychedelic Research
Nice.
Association on like in a couple of
Awesome.
weeks, I think, or like next week, about
Oh,
like how.
congratulations.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, like, and it's a presentation about how to quantify visual tracers. Like we have a developed some technology to do that, and yeah, basically all of that is building up to being able to actually tell how high a person is on a psychedelic and give you a score for it.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Okay.
anyway, there's like a lot of exciting things there. We also, I think, like provide like very meaningful and non-trivial insights in just philosophy of mind. Like we have solutions to, for example, the phenomenal binding problem, why functionalism cannot work, etc. And like, yeah, that's really kind of like hardcore philosophy of mind. And this year, most likely, we're going to publish in that domain. And then also like another comparative advantage that we have is essentially figuring out like ways uh, of essentially doing like small interventions that have like very massive hedonic payoffs.
Okay.
Essentially, for example, the thing that you've been working on, really grateful you've been helping out with, which is the
Oh, my
uh,
pleasure.
yeah, the project of figuring out how to prevent and cure kidney stones.
Yeah.
Yeah, very excited for that. And I mean, it sounds very random, but it's actually kind of a part of a holistic framework for valence optimization that we have, which is essentially pursuing the following three goals, which is like A, reduce negative extremes, B, increase the baseline of experience, and C, achieve new heights. And the reason why they're actually all like interlinked and like is that I think that you actually need to do the three of them if you want to maximize valence. Why? I mean, first of all, reduce negative extremes. That's because by probably a large shot, the bulk of suffering is concentrated in a relatively tiny percentage of cases. This
Ah,
is going to be true both in humans and in non-human animals, and that's a place where I think our work is really relevant to wild animal suffering. I'll
awesome.
go into that in a second.
Brilliant.
But the problem, though, is that if you put in all of your resources just on preventing negative extremes, you're not feeding back into the project in a sense,
Ah, okay.
into the overarching.
Becomes a bit warped in
Uh,
one what direction.
yeah, I mean, and the reason is that if you take somebody who's in -10 um, suffering, or like the worst suffering, and you take them to like let's say -4, it's like okay, like you actually took somebody who was in hell and you're putting them into like I don't know, a minor purgatory. Like you did a massive improvement, but at minus
Ultimate.
four at -4 you're still not going to be able to be very productive. So um, in a sense you also require to figure out ways of taking people who are like maybe at -2 and taking them to +3 or something like that, because that is kind of like there's a phase transition where you're actually able to be productive and useful in kind of like participating in a broader mission. Um, and finally achieving new heights. For example, like understanding the Janus and
Mhm.
5-MeO DMT and MDMA and all of that, like, really good stuff that can exist. All of that matters in order to actually have kind of a North Star of motivation, right? It's just so much better to be working towards, hey, like a future where we can all be on MDMA-like states of consciousness without
Absolutely, I agree.
neurotoxicity and cardiotoxicity, and that's kind of like really motivating and really
Yeah,
exciting as a like, okay, like a future actually worth living into. The like, okay, completely independently of, I don't know, the whatever the I don't know if it's like capitalistic hellscape or whatnot.
mm,
If you have access to MDMA states of consciousness, it actually wouldn't be that bad. So,
exactly.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah. So I think like sociologically, we need like to actually focus on the three at
Mm,
once. But in some sense, like even like working on like reducing negative extremes, to some extent, is kind of like paying rent. I would say. I mean, it's kind of like something
mm,
that even though right now we are not doing it the most optimal way possible, still pumping out some good work in that space is something that keeps us honest and value aligned. I mean,
mm,
essentially, it shows that, like, hey, we actually do care about the well-being of others, and we are doing things that are like very effective, and potentially very massive when it comes to improving um, the life of, yeah, other persons and other animals. And even though like it's not actually like maximizing the impact that we have yet, because a lot of the impact will actually come from closed loops that actually grow the movement exponentially. But I would say that we shouldn't only focus on growing the movement exponentially if we don't have a way of grounding it in a way
mm.
that will guarantee value alignment. So that is why, yeah, I mean, it's almost kind of like being able to work on, for example, preventing kidney stones and things of that sort is kind of like a value alignment, a way of guaranteeing value alignment. So that's why I still think we should do some of it, even if we're not doing only that. And I guess, yeah, to connect this to wild animal suffering, I mean, essentially, I think that something that is like missing from the conversation is that most likely suffering will be distributed along a long tail distribution in the natural world. So
Mm.
I find it very likely that like the bulk of suffering in the world probably comes from, let's say, like 100 species. Like there's probably 100 species that are generating the bulk of suffering, and they probably are not like intuitive. It's not
Mm.
like obvious like which ones they are. um, and second of all, the most intense forms of suffering will probably also account for a very large fraction of the total suffering. And
Oh,
I
okay. Never
strongly
considered this
suspect,
before. Never considered that before. Sorry.
yeah, no, that's, yeah, and I also strongly suspect that there's going to be species specific diseases
Mm.
that will also be responsible for a very big percentage of suffering. So one example could be, um, it may very well be the case that there are like some species that experience cluster headaches with a much higher
Ah,
frequency than the
mm.
average species.
Possible,
So
yeah.
we know, for example, that cats can experience cluster headaches, that cows can experience cluster
Oh,
headaches,
okay.
but it's not well known like what is the base rate. So my suspicion is that there's probably some animal out there, let's say like, I mean, it could very well be like cows, let's say, that it turns out that like 5% of them experience cluster headaches. And if that is true, then okay, like most farming wouldn't necessarily notice it because like maybe there's no evolutionarily adaptive response to it,
Mm.
but it would still definitely be happening there. And like the map of suffering of, let's say, like farmed animals will be such that, hey, actually the bulk of it is happening in these 5% of cows as opposed to
Wow.
in the chickens or in the pigs or so on. And it would be probably like extremely skewed. I mean, we might be talking about something like 99% of suffering is happening on the cows that are experiencing cluster headaches of all
You
of the
never
farmed
know.
animals.
Yeah.
And likewise, I think it's quite likely that, for example, some, I don't know, lizards, like maybe lizards suffer from a particularly horrible autoimmune disorder. And like maybe it's only like 10% of lizards, but the suffering could be so intense that
Mm,
actually it still accounts for the majority of reptile
mm,
suffering. So my suspicion in any case is that doing kind of a logarithmic scales analysis of the pleasure pain axis of wild animals will reveal that suffering is extremely skewed and that the priorities, the true priorities, are probably quite different than just the intuitive priorities that come when you just quantify, how many animals with how many neurons are there in the world.
I was going to say it's not uh, it's not particularly intuitive. It's quite counterintuitive, and we have biases, don't we? That kind of um, help that take us off course. But yeah, I'm chuckling because I just love your way with words, and yeah, it's just and yeah, you have a lot of ideas that really that are amazing, like cats and cows having cluster headaches. It's yeah, I just had this image of cows and cats huffing DMT pens. We
Yes.
never know. Talk about uplifting. You never know. We might see that within our lifetime. Um, oh goodness me, yeah, and yeah,
I mean, that would be, I think it's very plausible that like the single best intervention we could do to improve the lives of farmed animals would be like a button that like they press it and like DMT is released into them.
oh
Like it
yeah,
could actually be that, like that's like the top intervention that we could
it might be.
realistically make.
Or something like that. Yeah, the future is going to be very strange from our perspective. But yeah, when you mentioned about big bulk of suffering being localized and long-tail distribution in the natural world and species-specific conditions, I thought of some of the horrible things you sometimes see on nature documentaries with caterpillars and
Yeah.
is it the wasps, isn't it, that lay the eggs in caterpillars and come
Yeah.
out? Oh yeah, it's yeah. Um,
Yeah, no, it's very true. Like, and it
yeah.
probably, it might be as well things like there are some specific kinds of parasites
Mm,
that are especially painful, and like it might
yeah.
very well be like, okay, yeah, we actually just need to eradicate those parasites, and like maybe
Yeah.
20% of suffering will actually be averted.
Yeah, I know David Pierce hates mosquitoes in particular, and he champions their phasing out. And I can't say I blame him. Um, but you mentioned something very important when you talk about MDMA, and that's the neurotoxicity and other other substances that have quite neurotoxic, and I think that would be very very effective to kind of to find ways to limit or minimize neurotoxicity. Um, when you were talking about intensity of pain and pleasure and suffering and happiness, you use figures like -10 to 30. Do you have like an actual scale, or is it just relative or situational, and you just like use it comparatively? Is that
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would say there is a actual scale, and
hmm,
I mean the approximate, to a first approximation, I would refer you to the scales on logarithmic scales of pleasure and pain, where basically,
yes, yeah,
yeah, I lay out kind of these comparing like the intuitive linear scale versus the logarithmic or long tail scale,
hmm,
and it's both for pleasure and pain. That like MDMA would probably be something like a 7 out of 10
hmm,
pleasure, um, whereas like something like uh, yeah, basically the most profound like positive 5-MeO DMT experience you could have is probably like 10 out of 10 in that scale. Um, Feeling of like complete transcendence and
hmm,
being one with infinite consciousness, like all of that would be okay, like really up there. Um, and on the pain scale, yeah, like it also goes from like 0 to 10.
hmm,
Um, and it roughly scales down basically another scale, which is called the McGill Pain Index, which is like
Oh,
essentially one of the most comprehensive pain scales that I know of when I was doing like researching this space. And the reason why it's so comprehensive is because it essentially asks you in extreme detail about each part of your body, what kind of pain you're experiencing and to what intensity. So like it will ask you if
right.
you're experiencing like pins and needles or like stabbing pain or dull pain, and basically like this large list of possible pains. And it will aggregate all of those pains in every part of your body and weight them by their intensity. And that will give you a score, I believe, from 0 to 50. And different conditions have been mapped out in that scale. And that's where it's really obvious that you have things like cluster headache, it reaches all the way to like 46 or something like that in that scale. Whereas something like childbirth, I believe, is like 36 or something like that. So, or kidney stones are kind of like 40 in that scale. So um, that is one of the most comprehensive ways of kind of like getting at how painful something is. But
Mm.
it's also very true that it's still like not taking into account like mixed experiences. Like it's just kind of like a one-dimensional, positive to negative. Um, but then the other thing too is that it may overweight pains that come in a lot of qualitative different ways. So just one example, there's like this particularly horrible pain that is called the complex regional pain syndrome.
Not
It's
heard of that one.
CRPS.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, it's like a neuropathic thing. Like
Ah,
it's not necessarily like that you actually are injured. It's more like your nervous system is broken. And
ah,
but
yes. Yeah.
the thing with that pain is that it shows up essentially as um, lots of different kinds of pains. Like it feels like a mixture of stabbing and pins and needles and dull pain and
Whoa.
crushing pain. So there's a lot of
Right.
things going on.
Yeah.
And if you add them together, it shows up that, yeah, it kind of like tops the charts. But then like people who've experienced both that and cluster headaches, they will say cluster headaches are slightly more painful. So um, it actually, it might not be the best approach because it overweights like qualitative differences, but I think it's pretty close. And that is kind of like the main one that I used to kind of like base the 0 to 10 that is in the
Right.
logarithmic scales article.
Mm.
They're just like scaled it down, and I'm also adding a couple additional panes and trying to map them out. So um, I mean, in a sense, the question that remains open to me, and I think like we will be able to tell like not too far into the future, is like what is the actual logarithmic base for the scale. And I mean, in a sense, like we have concluded that a cluster headache is very likely at least 1 million times more painful than a pinprick. Um, so
Oh, wow. Okay.
yeah,
Calculated. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, and the thing is, like, you can triangulate these in various ways. I mean, one example is okay, like a bee sting is about like 10 times less painful than a harvester ant sting, and a harvester ant sting is about like 10 times less painful than a bullet ant or
Mm.
a tarantula hawk. So within those kind of like insects, you can approximate how painful they are. For example, you can um, get like 10 bees to sting you, and then compare that to a harvester ant, and they're roughly comparable. So that's where kind of like, okay, like this is clearly a logarithmic scale. And then you can map on to the traditional scale from 0 to 10, like, okay, where is a bee sting? Where is a harvester ant sting? And if you do that, from like the last estimate I recall, we're talking about something that is approximately like every 2.5 points, or every 2 points or something like that is like a 10x increment. So um, like that's why like you can actually get to the level of like 1,000,000 if you consider kind of like a pinprick to be something like what is it, like 0.1 in the pain scale or something like that. So um, yeah, and it sounds kind of like ridiculous to say it, but yeah, I mean actually you end up with these very crazy things where hey, like actually a cluster headache is literally 100 times more intense than a migraine, even though a migraine
Yeah.
is already like incredibly intense. So um, those numbers are, yeah, in a sense, like really crazy and exponential. But that's what we seem to infer based on all of these lines of evidence.
I think that could help revolutionize medicine and therapeutics because I think we still rely on people's subjective descriptions of how painful something is, and maybe if we had some kind of implant or some kind of therapeutic biohacking using devices to help accurately measure, calculate, and display how much pain is being experienced. That could be connected to someone's phone or eyeglasses or dermal display, uh, um, telling people how bad pain is, maybe a bit more accurately and in a more measured fashion than kind of people's subjective descriptions, which might not be very accurate, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, and when you talk about CRPS being it was neuropathic pain, that's what they prescribe gabapentin and pregabalin for, I think, unless I'm
Yeah,
mistaken.
yeah.
Yeah,
For some of them, I mean, those
GABA
might be a little
agonists.
bit too painful for for them to really be effective. I think
Oh,
like for
really?
something like
Whoa. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, like when you're talking about like that kind of pain, like usually opioids are like necessary,
Oh,
but
yeah. Yeah.
and they are often like not sufficient.
Mm,
They're just not powerful enough. Um,
mm.
yeah, I mean sometimes like some like low level painkiller can do like miracles. So, like sometimes like somebody with like neuropathic pain, like extreme neuropathic pain, might take something like gabapentin, and they might say like, wow, the pain actually went away. But like,
Mm.
and my interpretation of that is that, I mean, essentially that particular pain was relying on a very, very finely tuned like wave propagation dynamic that, like in this case, something like gabapentin disrupted. But that is going to be like an atypical response. Oftentimes, is
Right.
more that like gabapentin will reduce the pain by like a couple points
Mm.
on average, and for most people experiencing intense pain, that's just not going to be enough for like good quality of life. um, which is why, I mean, like from my perspective, like a very big aspect of like what actually will revolutionize pain management in the hopefully near future is going to be this whole area of anti-tolerance drugs, which
Oh,
is
yeah, I was going to come
essentially
to that. Yeah.
yeah,
Beat me
yeah,
to it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, essentially, like it is really crazy that like there are substances that if you take in conjunction with
Yeah, there
a
must be. Yeah.
painkiller, essentially you prevent the development of tolerance to them,
Mm.
or you might even reverse them. So like ibogaine, very classically, is considered kind of like a like a treatment for addiction,
Mm.
especially let's say like a hardcore opioid like heroin. But
That's right. Yeah.
what is even crazier is like not only it gives rise to kind of a psychological reevaluation of your life, it
Mm.
also
Ah, yeah.
actually literally reverses the tolerance at the biochemical level, where like all of a sudden
Whoa. Right.
you need like 90% less morphine for the same level of pain relief. Or
90%. Wow.
yeah, 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 like very, very significant changes, and
Very,
like you
very
may not
dramatic.
experience like withdrawal at all
Yeah.
during ibogaine. So uh, my suspicion is that okay, like ibogaine itself is kind of a dangerous drug, so like probably we're not going to use ibogaine directly, but we might use like ibogaine analogs or like something that
Yeah.
has the same biochemical effect as ibogaine tolerance
Ibergoids.
wise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ibergoids.
Yes. And essentially I suspect in the, I don't know, in like 20 years or something, doctors will just not prescribe like painkillers without anti-tolerance drugs. Like I think it's probably going to flip to such an extent that it's going to be considered barbaric to prescribe something that you develop tolerance to without something that counteracts that tolerance. It's my long-term prediction.
Yeah, I agree. I think we could be there already today, and it actually makes me angry that there are treatments out there that could achieve this by now already today, but it's kept hidden under the rug, except until a couple of years pass. So it's very unfortunate. But ibogaine is quite a little bit cardiotoxic, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, exactly.
So they ask you to do. I think they ask you to do an ECG first before taking it to make sure you won't.
Yeah, and ideally,
a heart attack.
Ideally, one within as well.
Right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I hope we will see these pharmacological revolutions where we'll have anti-neurotoxicity interventions for substances like MDMA or a less neurotoxic analog, anti-tolerance for opioids, definitely also anti-withdrawal interventions for people coming off benzos and GABA agonists or cold turkey, God forbid. I mean, I know it sounds rather dramatic, but the people withdrawing off things like benzos and GABA agonists is horrific. I mean, obviously, as well, and it does make me wonder whether we're all already in some kind of hell realm, because that is something that's as bad as that is allowed to exist. And it really creeps me out, actually, because you read the descriptions and see videos of people crying, but they can't stop moving because they've got I think it's akathisia, isn't it?
That's right, akathisia. Yep.
Yeah, and it's very chilling.
Yep. No, it's true. It's terrifying, and I mean, it is. There's something related here to wild animal suffering, which is like out of sight, out of mind, right? It's
right.
And I mean, that's something for sure that I would say like I've struggled most of my life with, which is like kind of like probably having like a much more automatic awareness of like these terrible things than most people. For some reason, like it's kind of like sticks out in my mind more easily. I mean, I remember as a kid just kind of like continuing to think about like the poor guy at the intersection asking for money like several hours afterwards. But the thing though is like you actually need to, like, in the ideal world we would be cultivating an ethical movement and an aesthetic where you actually do work towards the alleviation of the worst suffering, but B, also in a sense like figure out a way to be working in that capacity without yourself becoming too depressed or obsessed about it. So there's definitely the risk of kind of a poor mental health when you're like actually contemplating all of these very difficult, challenging realities. And it is kind of like very unfortunate that if you actually look around, like people who are like negative utilitarians, think about suffering all the time, like for the most part, they tend to have kind of like much more depressive temperaments. And it's not a good advertisement for the movement, unfortunately. It's kind of like if I was a parent, I would actually be kind of afraid if my kid starts to like talk a lot about antinatalism. It's kind of
my own parents got quite concerned with me about some of the things I got into and read about as well. Bless them. So I understand where you're coming from there. But it's one of the biggest hazards of suffering abolitionism is the effect on mental health. As you correctly touched upon, I remember Jonatas Muller, and I don't know if you ever met Ben Hink. I don't know how to pronounce his surname. It's Hyink, Ben Hink, and Jonatas Muller, and yeah, it's very sad, and I think there should be some kind of service or intervention for people in our line of work who have a greater awareness of some really some of the worst forms of suffering that are happening in the world, and of course it's going to have an effect on our mental health, definitely. Depressive realism, I believe, is one kind of school of thought where the person who is afflicted with depression has a more accurate kind of view of the universe. But yeah, I remember DMT being mentioned as something that can help smoking cessation as well, because we were talking about that before. And yeah, I remember reading about someone who took DMT, and then they actually gagged when they tried to have a cigarette afterwards, because they could help break those circuits.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
I'm not too acquainted with functionalism. Do you mind explaining a bit more about that?
Yeah.
I've heard the word before, but I'm not sure what it is.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I would say this is the kind of the most mainstream theory of consciousness nowadays, and it's implicitly assumed in most discussions of, for example, mind uploading. So what functionalism says is that what matters for consciousness is not only the input-output mapping that a system does, although that is like very important, but it's not all that matters. What also matters is the way in which the information is handled from the input to the output, such that what a mind is actually the collection of algorithms that handle the information from the input to the output. So in the world of a functionalist, you can effectively have two systems that have the same input-output mapping, but if they handle the information differently, they could have like different experiences. They could have like different consciousness. Now, typically, they will say something along the lines of, well, most likely the conscious experience that we have is actually the result of a fairly well optimized information processing, such that if you have a system that is behaving in any way as intelligent as a human person, as a human mind, most likely it must be actually using similar algorithms, or at least like algorithms that are like equally efficient. And in that sense, they will generally take as evidence of consciousness, intelligent, like human level intelligent behavior, to such an extent that, yeah, I mean, I would say like a substantial percentage of people in that cluster would assign like non-trivial consciousness to, for example, GPT-3, or to, for example, AlphaZero or AlphaGo, because they're like doing like, yeah, essentially fairly non-trivial management of information in a close to optimal way. And that said, a functionalist will also say things such as, if you simulate a brain with the entire population of China, where like, let's say every person pretends to be a neuron, and then you have kind of these like network of telegrams, they will say like, okay, you can actually create an experience with kind of like an emulation like that. And so typically functionalists will not care about like scale or substrate. Like, as long as the bits of information are being handled in the appropriate way, they will say like, that is what consciousness ultimately is constituted of. Whereas somebody like us, who basically believe that consciousness arises at the implementation level, they will say that, hey, actually there are some features of experience, like the unity of experience, that require a substrate level property, such as, in our case, like topological unity. Like, you actually require something at the substrate level that to bind together the information into a unified whole. I mean, the sort of explanation that we pursue, like, usually is associated with this unfortunate side effect, which is epiphenomenalism, which is that, okay, like if the thing that matters for consciousness is a substrate, not the algorithm, then it sounds like you could have like two systems that behave exactly the same way, but one is made of like meat and the other one is made of, I don't know, like electrodes, or let's say like even like a system of water gates or something like that. And they will complain that like, hey, like somebody who believes in the implementation level of consciousness will say that like, okay, maybe only the meat one matters, only the meat one has consciousness, not the other one. And that sounds like arbitrary. So they will say that sounds like carbon chauvinism, that like just because it's made of carbon, like you assign like extra properties to it. But that's not at all actually how like our theory of consciousness works out, because in our theory of consciousness, actually the implementation level details have functional implications. So the fact that the fields of physics are actually topologically united in our brain has functional implications, and it's actually speeding up certain algorithms in a way that would be much slower to perform if you were using just a discrete system or like a von Neumann machine. So in that sense, like, you can recognize consciousness in our theory by the computational speedups that it allows. So like if you do have a system, it has a certain number of particles, but it's doing information processing with a certain runtime complexity, you can infer that most likely it is conscious because it must be using the fields of physics for computation. So you can still infer things about consciousness just based on behavior and just based on the computational speed, but it's not inherent to computational speed. Also in our theory, you can actually create two systems that have the exact same input-output mapping, but that one is conscious and the other is not. It's just that you will require a lot of attention to detail. I mean, it's sort of like you will have to engineer them really specifically that way, with a lot of kind of tricks and smoke and mirror in order to make it look like that way. But the truth is that there are a lot of like ways of pulling it off. So like one simple example is you can use a lookup table. So like if instead of a brain, I actually had just like this massive lookup table where like for every input, there's a mapping to a particular response. And maybe even part of the response is like, hey, like wait a couple seconds and then say X. That would trivially not be conscious. I mean, essentially just an input-output mapping via a lookup table is obviously not conscious because it doesn't have the internal complexity. In a sense, like the system is not aware of like what it's mapping to what. It doesn't have an internal representation. So like it's even just from that alone, we know that like actually the behavior is not enough for consciousness. So we already kind of agree on that. But yeah, the place where it's a little bit more tricky is when people complain about like, well, but if it behaves exactly the same all the way to the atomic level, except that the atoms are made of different elements, like would that matter? And the answer is it may actually still matter because the implementation level details may give rise to binding or not. But typically binding will have also behavioral effects. So in the typical scenario, you could actually tell if something is conscious by its behavior, but not always. Anyway, hopefully that clarified a little bit. It's a huge rabbit hole.
There's lots of isms and ologies out there. I'm not acquainted with all of them, so it's good for me as well. Brilliant. Yeah, I was just thinking about ways that which suffering could be experienced in unusual ways, and I was just thinking about like what we were talking about some pharmacology before. What wild animals must be absorbing in the water because there's all sorts that we come out in our urine, and I remember reading something about fish being affected by some of the opiate content in the water that comes from from out from out of us, and what that could be doing to some of the wild animals. And it's it's very sad to imagine an animal suffering something that is so beyond their level of awareness. And I'm sure a lot of humans think suffering becomes more horrific when it's not easy to understand why it's happening to you, I think.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, totally. I mean, like one argument I would say for sure for why I care about the suffering of non-human animals is that I mean, it's kind of like flipping the argument in that, like, for a lot of people, they will say that the reason why human suffering matters is because it actually interfaces with meaning. But as it turns out, meaning is an antidepressant. So the fact that you can actually give meaning to your suffering, it's actually going to lessen the intensity of that suffering. It's going to twist it in a way. It's actually taking some of the juice off of the suffering by contextualizing it. And that's like, basically an affordance that non-human animals really don't have. So from the point of view of a non-human animal that is suffering in the moment, I would actually suspect that all else being equal, it's somewhat worse than human, because the human can actually think about the future. Well, this is only, like this is going to end, or this is for the sake of my family, whatever it may be, which,
The animals don't have that luxury, unfortunately.
No, I don't think so.
But that's well put. Meaning is an antidepressant. It reminds me of that book by it was Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, when he was in Auschwitz, and the thought of his life back with his wife kept him going through that awful suffering.
Exactly. And I mean, and that's one of the other, right, like, I would say that for a lot of people, philosophical hedonism is something they have a negative aesthetic response to.
Right,
so like you talk about like, hey, all that we care about is maximizing pleasure, reducing suffering. They might say like, no, like that sounds horrible. That sounds like a terrible worldview. Actually, what I care about is meaning, or something like that. But I mean, if you introspect on the nature of meaning, it actually, you will realize that it has this suffering lessening quality. So and actually, like, hyper meaningful states of consciousness tend to be very embodied consonant states of experience. So you may not realize it at first, but actually you pursuing meaning is still pursuing states of bodily well-being, which
that catches
you may not be
out.
aware of at all.
It does. That catches people out, and they think, because they think negatively of hedonism, but they are still experiencing pleasure. It's just from a higher ideal, or ascribing meaning to something.
Yep, exactly. And you can even say, like, you can show these with, I mean, the obvious example is taking something like naltrexone, which is an opioid antagonist. If you take some naltrexone right before your college graduation, it's not going to feel very meaningful. And you're actually,
that's brilliant. That'd be an interesting experiment. Naltrexone.
And I mean, similarly, like attending a wedding while you're experiencing chronic pain, for example, like it will actually be like impairing some of the meaning making capacity that you have. So they're like intimately connected.
Or taking naltrexone before a marathon and you miss out on the runner's high.
Yep, that sounds so miserable.
That sounds like a very novel experiment. No one else would have done that before. Take naltrexone for a 24-mile marathon. Do you have a preference for like negative utilitarianism, like the minimization of suffering, or positive utilitarianism and the maximization of positive valence and pleasure? And this is what I think, can the two mega projects work simultaneously? Because I don't think they are mutually exclusive goals to have.
I definitely have a lot to say here. So, I mean, first of all, I think that, I mean, to a first approximation, I would say that it's important to be agnostic about this. Like my overall stance is that we should neither commit to negative nor classical utilitarianism.
Ah,
And actually, we should like wait until we have a science of valence in order to actually, in some sense, like figure this out from first principles. And
mm,
I mean, I have the hope. I mean, this comes from Mike Johnson. Actually, like he kind of like introduced me to this idea that it may very well be that a full science of valence, where when we have like formalized the valence into its mathematical properties, that in a sense the truth of like negative or classical utilitarianism will just kind of pop out of the math. Like that
mm,
is the hope, and I think it's quite plausible. Like I'm pretty sure like that the math of valence will, at the very least, inform what kind of ethical theories make sense. At the
mm.
very least, it's probably going to rule a bunch of ethical theories. Um, so that is like one point. But then also, I would say to a second approximation, I do have a lot of respect for negative utilitarians. To
Yes.
some extent, I consider negative utilitarians to be very morally serious in that, like,
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, is like if somebody says like, "Hey, I'm a classical utilitarian," in some sense, they are saying if you're suffering from a gunshot, right next door, but I'm at a party and the party is good enough, if the party is good enough, I'm probably not going to help you, right? Because it's just going to be sufficiently disvaluable to, disrupt the party
Yeah.
to actually help you with your, I don't know, gunshot, right? So,
Yeah.
uh,
It reminds me of that party meme. Sorry. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
That
So
was
like,
fun.
or a gunshot wound. Yeah. So basically, negative utilitarians would actually stop the party and
Yeah.
help you out. And
Oh,
like,
that's of course.
there's,
Yeah, the wood. Yeah.
yeah, so there's definitely like a feeling, like a sense of like, okay, moral seriousness and comfort and security even
Mm.
with like, okay, like another example that David Pierce puts out is imagine that like you press one button and here in the left somebody is going to be growing pleasure super exponentially,
Mm.
whereas like in the left they're going to be growing pleasure only exponentially. So it's going to become like worse and worse and worse and worse,
Right.
but on the right is going to become better and better at a faster pace.
Yeah.
A classical utilitarian would say like, yeah, you're morally obliged to press that button. So
Right.
there's
Yeah.
like these
Yeah.
things that actually sound pretty terrifying about classical utilitarianism. And in that sense,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like at a felt sense, I do get the feeling that negative utilitarians are like more morally serious in a way.
Mm.
Like they are, you can tell that they're like more willing to sacrifice their own pleasure for the sake of the well-being of others to
Very
some extent.
noble.
Yeah, more very noble.
Mm.
Um, at the same time, I also believe that we should bite the bullet, no matter how horrible it is. So, like, if it turns out from the math that actually something like classical utilitarianism is more true, more
Mm.
closer to truth, we should still bite that bullet and say, like, yeah, it sounds horrible, but like, okay, this is what reality actually wants. And I think
Mm.
that's also possible. I'm not discarding that possibility. Um, but then the other very important perspective is, okay, like this whole idea of you I don't know what Jesus would say. You shall know them by their fruits, right? So it's kind of
Yeah.
like, on the one hand, I do strongly believe that we should be as legible as possible and like like state our beliefs as clearly and as honestly as possible. At the same time, we should also keep track of how beliefs influence actual outcomes. And it just seems also pretty clear to me that entire communities just based on the negative utilitarian aesthetic, they tend to not be very healthy
Mm.
emotionally, and they
Yes,
tend to
I
kind
agree.
of like fester. A lot of like negativity ends up like festering in such communities. And
Yeah.
um, ends up being very depressive, and it's not very it doesn't build up to things that add a lot of value. So
Yeah, very demoralizing.
it's yeah, very demoralizing. So it's kind of ironic that, like, okay, effectively it may end up actually being the case
Hmm.
that classical utilitarians are doing more good, even by negative utilitarian standards, than negative utilitarians. And it could actually be the case that a lot of what is going on in negative utilitarian communities is more of the virtue signaling kind than
Okay.
actually like minimizing suffering
Ah,
throughout the living world. That people are more concerned with signaling kind of a ideological purity than they're concerned with actually having a positive impact. So
purity
um,
spiral.
yeah, and it actually may turn out to be the case that, like, the most effective people are people who are, I don't know, like Stoics, for example, that they're not actually thinking in terms of maximization or
Mm,
minimization of anything,
mm,
but just in practice they form like very solid communities that people can rely on each other, high trust. They
yeah.
actually, pull in the same direction. So all of that are things that I think are important to consider. um, but I also, I guess, I would conclude that I would find it really sad if we can't find a way of um, getting our explicit values to actually have the explicit effects that we want them to. So
Mm,
for me, in the ideal world, you could be in a community where people say, like, hey, I'm a negative utilitarian, like, that's fine, but they don't get depressed and they actually work effectively and have like
enjoy
really
life.
meaningful, joyous lives. So if we could have that, I think that would be the best of all worlds, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure how plausible it is.
I think extremes of negative utilitarianism takes you to like where David Benatar is and people like that, which is quite an unhealthy place for the
Yeah, yeah.
for that person. Um,
It's like you walk down the park and you see, like, you see a mom with his child, her child, and like, and you think, like, oh, what a horrible person must
yeah,
that must
bringing
they
in.
be?
I'm not an antinatalist, I must admit, and it just kind of makes me feel sad a little bit when, but I understand why. But I don't really identify with antinatalism myself.
Yeah,
Maybe before, but now I think, oh well, look, well, cute kids, which is much more, uh, much better for my own morale and mental health and
yeah,
such like. I think opiates could be a good example of illustrating that negating pain and suffering and amplifying happiness and pleasure do not have to be mutually exclusive, and they are also, in my opinion, a real life rebuttal against critics of the hedonistic imperative and the abolitionist project who say that we would all become unmotivated, lotus-eating, grinning idiots, as there are plenty of accounts describing how, for some people, opiates are actually highly motivating and even
yeah.
mind and creativity expanding. Obviously, not in a psychedelic way, but in their own right. And
Yeah,
when you look back at like the romantic period of poets in terms of the creativity expansion, then
yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, like, we
yeah,
definitely are very opioid phobic as a culture, but
yeah,
yeah, no, I mean, I think, like, as
opioid-phobic.
soon as we have like some really solid anti-tolerance system,
Mm.
it's possible everybody will be taking opiates. Please don't quote me on this, but
No, no, I'll just edit that bit
it's
out.
it seems plausible, actually. But either way, I mean, like, you still have like evolutionary selection pressures. So we're like, okay, like, even if
Yes.
we generate a super morphine or something like that,
Mm.
that does make you a couch potato, but it is wonderful and sustainable.
Mm.
Like, yeah, chances are, like, you will have like a generation of people that essentially fall for that. But then, like, in the next generation, people are not falling for that. Like,
Yeah.
like, people forget just like how massive, for example, were the epidemics of alcohol. Like, when you started to have like
Mm.
distillates. So, like, for example, there was uh, the gene, what is it called? Like the gene epidemic. You can look it up on Wikipedia.
Gene epidemic.
Uh, yeah, it's really hilarious. I mean, like, in the UK, there was like a gene epidemic, lasted something like 15 years, and like it was ridiculous. It was something like 60% of people were like alcoholic. like ridiculous numbers
Well,
of people affected. And then after a generation and a half, all of a sudden is like, oh, like that essentially didn't happen. Like people just kind of developed a cultural immunity to it. And yeah, sure, there is like the drunk down the down the store, down the corner, but just it's not the case that everybody's drunk all the time, which
right.
like was the case for for like more than a decade.
Yeah, I always found alcohol to excess very dysphoric, and I was always puzzled by people who were addicted to it because I found it quite dysphoric, especially being drunk. It was it was a bit like a bad trip, when the room's spinning and you just want it to be over and you feel awful. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think I managed to sidestep that one, which is
Yep.
which is good because it's obviously we all know the dangers.
Yeah. I mean, alcohol is definitely very tricky
Mm,
pharmacologically, and I do have like maybe a little bit of a hot take on alcohol, which is that I mean it's actually quite a fascinating psychoactive substance.
yes,
Um,
oh certainly.
and basically, like yeah, for sure, like people have like different reactions to it, but there's like essentially like three effects that it has, or four, depending on how
Right.
you count. But there is the depressant effect, which the
Yeah.
positive side of it will be like anxiolytic, will reduce your anxiety. Like that is for sure like a very important component of it, and like
Yeah.
that
GABA
also
agonism.
reduces your yeah,
Yeah.
exactly GABA agonism. But then you also have like dopamine agonism. Like essentially a
Ah, yes.
downstream effect of alcohol is like for a lot of people is very dopaminergic. So like
Oh, I didn't
it
know that.
is like a very small amount of amphetamine or something like that, especially at the
Ah,
beginning when you're
okay.
coming up.
Yeah.
Um, and
That
actually,
explains a lot.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, but not everybody has that reaction. And actually, I think like there's probably a long tail of that. Like some people I've seen like have like a couple drinks and they're kind of like running and they're like super euphoric and just like completely different person. Whereas yeah, for most people they have a couple sips and like they are like a little bit more chill. Like
Yeah.
they don't
Oh,
have like
so many
that
different
powerful.
reactions. Yeah.
Yep.
Angry as well and
Yeah.
hateful.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the last one is it has a bit of a dissociative effect. So uh,
Oh, okay.
I actually think like the most interesting aspect of alcohol, um, Sasha Shulgin points it out, is like that wonderful period when you took one drink and are
Mm,
like drinking your second one, but you're not done. You kind
mm.
of like you have like one and a half drink and you're working on the second drink. And there's maybe a period of like 5 to 10 minutes where you have like hints of like ketamine, essentially hints of like an
Huh.
NMDA antagonist, kind of a slightly dissociative. And that is, I think, like the period where you have kind of like some opening and kind of a loosening of priors and
Oh.
ideas
Mm,
and that's where you can be a little bit creative and you
mm.
may be inspired, but it's just so short lasting. It's like just so fleeting. But yeah,
Not worth
anyway,
the
that's
trouble.
kind of sorry, what?
Might not be worth the trouble if it's that fleeting.
Exactly, like uh but if we could find like some drug that produces that effect specifically in a
Yeah.
reliable fashion, like that would
Yeah.
be fantastic. And I think like the thing that probably gets the closest to it would actually be MXC, which is like
Oh,
this
yes.
yeah, dissociative drug. So
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I did not know that. That's blown my mind. That's brilliant. Uh, Andres, are you okay to leave it there for a bit?
yeah, sure.
I think we've got lots of good material and we've covered a lot of really interesting ground.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
and yeah, I've recorded it all. Uh, Excellent. I really enjoyed that, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you. And I, um, I have lots of other questions, but I'll save those for another time. If you'd like to do another one sometime in a
Yeah,
couple of months,
sure. Yeah,
and
this was fun.
yeah, I'll keep you updated about the kidney stone project, and or we could have a discussion about that at your earliest convenience if you like, and so that you know how I'm getting on.
Perfect. Perfect.
Excellent.
Yeah. And I mean, I definitely intend to publish it as soon as possible. I mean, like, yeah. plausibly like in February is I think
February.
most likely.
Brilliant.
And yeah. Also, I don't know if I mentioned like I'll be doing a TEDx talk
No,
in
you didn't.
Miami.
No, you didn't
Yeah,
mention that.
that's
Oh,
exciting.
fantastic! Congratulations.
Thank you. It's on using psychedelics for relieving extreme suffering is the topic. So
Oh, that's fantastic. What's the date? Is it going to be live, broadcast live, or?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's gonna be on YouTube
Well, be on
eventually.
YouTube eventually. Yeah.
It's gonna be on May 19th in Miami. I'm
Wow,
actually gonna travel to Miami for that. So
that's
yep.
fantastic. Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's
Thank you.
brilliant. I look forward to seeing how it goes. Cool. Thanks again, Andres. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you as always. And yeah, I'll sign off for now, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Okay. Thanks.
Cool.
Cool.
Excellent. All right.
Thanks
Take
again,
care.
everybody.
Ciao,
See you
ciao.
later. Bye bye.